This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Joe Yule. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast with me, Joe Yule. And I wanted to start with a statistic that dropped into my inbox this week. And that is, if every single one of us wore a pre-loved outfit on Christmas Day this year, then the CO2 emissions saved would be equivalent to taking 56 million cars off the road for a day. Now, we all know fashion by its very nature is not sustainable, and it's widely reported, along with its supply chain, to be the third largest polluting industry after food and construction, emitting 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions and releasing 1.2 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. Now, that's more than the shipping industry and the aviation industry combined, which gives us a little bit of insight as to why many of us boycotted Black Friday last month, but also into why we need to think a little bit more deeply before we dash out onto the high street and start snapping up clobber in a last-minute Christmas panic buy this year. So in today's episode, we're exploring what measures we can take to boycott fast fashion this festive season, what other options are available to us to look good, but also feel good about what we're wearing. Plus, we are going to go a little bit deeper into what measures are being taken by the UN to clamp down with the launch of the Sustainability Pledge and how that was represented at last month's COP27 in Egypt, and have a conversation about how we can also identify greenwashing, what it means to be an imperfect environmentalist, how we can create more transparency, and what pilots are underway to do so using the latest technology. And finally, explore some activism already in play and what ways we can come together to find a long-term solution. But first, I'm joined by Tiffany Dark, a fashion editor and journalist contributing to the Financial Times, the Sunday Times, and who's a sustainable campaigner and co-founder of Agora Ibiza, a sustainable fashion boutique on the island. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us here today.
My absolute pleasure, Joe.
Thank you as well for emailing me this week about the Hubbub CO2 campaign. And I think that's a good jump off point for today's conversation. What did you think when you first read that statistic?
I think what it really brings home is the implications of our actions. So fashion is something that we all hugely enjoy, and it is a touchstone of joy, and it's a pastime. It's a cultural reference point. It's something, that is really about life itself. And then attached to fashion now are all these terrible statistics, which basically paint the picture of the implications of what we do, which is when we overconsume, and we have overconsumed and gorged ourselves on fashion for far too long, we are devastating the environment. And who knew that it was so impactful, that amount of consumption on Christmas Day, our sort of one-off Christmas jumper buys, or quick nip to H&M to buy myself a red sparkly dress for Christmas Day, that with all of the people in the world doing that has so much carbon impact that statistic is with the numbers that were crunched that came out of it. I mean, it's just devastating to think that something that should be fun and joyful is now so harmful to the environment.
I mean, sometimes sustainability seems to come across, as you've just highlighted, this idea that you have to make less and have absolutely nothing, and obviously that you have to buy less, but that's actually it's unrealistic in some ways because it's just kind of counterintuitive to who we are as humans, and especially obviously the way that the fashion industry actually works. I mean, what are your thoughts about this time of year, about how we even begin to sort of change our ways?
Yeah, I've given it a lot of thought, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, because I've had to do all my Christmas gifting, which, has been very tempting to open up that Amazon app and and swipe right for add to basket. Christmas is a time of loving and kindness and giving, and that at its base is such a beautiful thing and shouldn't be lost. And also, especially after the last couple of years where we've all been curtailed in our actions, and this Christmas feels like a moment when we can all come together and show each other love and kindness and giving. But it's all happening at exactly the same time as the cost of living crisis. So many pressures on the world that are bearing down on us right now. So it creates this really interesting tension between actions past, what we're used to, which is, over-consuming, overabundance, and actions present, which is actually not all of us can afford to do all of this now. And actually not all of us can afford to do it in terms of environmental and natural capital reasons. So, we have to reframe our approach to consumption and reframe our approach to fashion. But I totally agree with you, which is the moment you take the joy out of something and you start harping on about sustainability and, hammering it down people's throats that actually, the world is all going to hell in a handcart and we all have to stop immediately, then you switch off and it all just becomes doom and gloom and dreadful. And fashion, which was sort of a moment of joy, turns into a sort of, guilt-ridden moment where you have to beat yourself with a stick. So, I think you can flip the script and you can talk about some really lovely ways in which you can still indulge in fashion and have a clear conscience. One of them that was pointed out to me quite recently was the Japanese art of decorative mending, which is such a beautiful concept. So, you take all those moth-eaten jumpers in your wardrobe, or things that have got holes in them or that you've stopped wearing because they've got rips or tears, and actually you can make a virtue of those things and start embroidering them and turn them into beautiful objects. Actually, there's a brand that we stock in Agora called Kilometre 5, where she takes old Victorian, if you like, cotton nightshirts that she buys in kind of vintage sales, and she go into chateaus which are being kind of closed down, and there are fire sales of furniture and what they found in the cupboards, and she'll buy up 50 of these old cotton nightshirts. Some of them are 100, 150 years old, but because the cotton was made so beautifully then and is of such a durable quality, the shirts are fine. And then what she'll do is just beautiful embroidery over the bits where they've worn thin or they've got, bits that need mending, and turn them into these lovely, unique, kind of one-of-a-kind items, which are really just kind of new objects in themselves. And that's such a lovely idea. Then there's also, swapping. We can actually, swap like for like with our wardrobe. So these amazing swapping parties going on right now where you can all come together as a group, as a community of friends. Everybody brings along 5 items of clothing that they're a bit tired of in their wardrobe, and you switch it all out, and then you go home with 5 new items. And again, that's not creating any impact on the environment. Rental is another lovely option. Now, it's not completely clean in terms of, we've got the dry cleaning, we've got the transport costs. But actually, if you're going to a party, which I'm sure everybody is going to hundreds of in Ibiza this festive season, rather than buying yourself a new outfit, think about renting one. We launched the Cinderella concept at Agora this summer, and gosh, it took so much persuading of brands to let us have some of the archive pieces in their evening wear collections, despite the fact that for the last 3 years during the pandemic, they really hadn't sold much evening wear at all. And switch some of those brands' business models to one of rent rather than sale. But, eventually we broke through, and, we now have quite a nice selection of brands up there of archive pieces, and you can come in and rent for like 120 euros a night a beautiful designer gown, David Comer, Alice Temperley, Ilta, lots of really beautiful brands. And it's for one night only. And actually, if you think about evening wear, you don't wear the same dress again and again and again, because you usually see the same people at the same parties, don't you? So renting is a really lovely one. Yeah, I mean, there are ways of consuming fashion whilst being, less carbon intensive, but I think we need to switch the mindset and just be a whole lot more creative in our approach.
I think it's, I feel like we're going a bit back to the old WI times where we're going to be having these parties where we're sitting around doing our knitting, learning to crochet and darn. And I think that's a really great idea. But I mean, I think people have just lost the art of those skills. I certainly wasn't. I mean, actually, that's a lie. I was brought up doing my knitting by my grandma. But I think there's a lot of people out there that, wouldn't know where to begin to do those kinds of creative things. So I think that, maybe those kinds of parties are the future. We could get together and actually learn how to do those things, as well as perhaps swap things at the same time. I mean, I obviously, love this idea that things like, mushroom, apple and cactus leather and a whole lot more are coming onto the market. But I also, really love the idea that people are talking about, and we're going to hear a little part of this conversation shortly, that happened in your very own boutique last month with Lily Cole. That was when a teenager piped up to ask about, how can we actually sit there lecturing everybody about fast fashion where girls of her age could never dream of affording the sustainably produced luxuries that we were kind of sitting there talking about. And I thought that was really interesting because, particularly in the run up to Christmas, that's definitely the time, or when you've got your Christmas money that you use to go up to London or whatever and go and splash out in the January sales. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, do you think thus far that most of this sort of sustainable fashion is for people with perhaps slightly deeper pockets?
Yeah, totally. I'm afraid it is, because creating something sustainably just costs more money. You can go to Shein or Pretty Little Thing or Boohoo, and actually on Black Friday they were selling dresses for 85 pence. I mean, come on. Because obviously the carbon cost of those products is not built into the pricing structure. So that's where Generation Z and, the young consumers go, because that's what they can afford. If you want to buy a beautiful silk shirt with a very transparent supply chain that has, been made with the no killing to any silkworms and, created in a well-supported factory where the garment workers are, paid a sustainable living wage, I'm afraid it's going to cost you, 3 figures and more. So, obviously people who can afford that can do that if that's their set of values, and those that can't have to make more creative and interesting choices. But when this 13-year-old girl piped up, the conversation also switched to the fact that her generation are much, much more au fait with re-commerce sites like Depop and StockX and those kind of sites where buying second, third or fourth hand has no stigma to it whatsoever. And for people of our generation, charity shopping or vintage stores, there was a bit of a stigma attached to it. But for those guys, they see it just as a great way of getting their hands on product that they wouldn't normally be able to get in shops, either because it's priced differently or because of the way that it's been released in sort of limited edition street style drops. So I think already consumer habits are changing within that generation. I think also it's beholden on the older generation to sponsor the younger generation through this a little bit. So actually, I'm launching a campaign in the new year based around the hot or cold climate issues report, that actually, if fashion wants to reach its 2030 1.5 degrees targets, all the kind of new fabric innovations and supply chain transparencies in the world is not going to help us do that. We actually have to buy and consume less. And they've crunched all the numbers, and the figure they've come up with is just 5 items a year. Yeah. So we are only allowed to buy 5 new fashion items a year. And once you get over the shock of that, actually, it's quite nice, because you think, well, if I'm only allowed 5 items, what are those items going to be? And am I going to value those items? And instead of buying 3 pairs of crappy shoes for summer, maybe I'll buy one beautifully made leather sandal that's going to last me the next 10 years. If I'm going to buy a coat for winter, I'm going to make sure that that is the most beautiful coat I can get my hands on, that's going to deliver me 20 years plus of joy, and that I can pass down to my children. Anyway, to return to your point about the younger generation, in the setting up of this campaign, I realized that it was very easy to get people of Generation X and older involved because we've all got lovely big wardrobes we can source from. But how difficult is it to get a 20-something or a teenager to be part of this? So one of the concepts I've come up with is that we, the elders, should gift the youngers one of our 5. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm only allowed 5 items next year, and I'm going to give one of those items to someone younger than me so that she at least gets 6. But I do think, it's part of the responsibility that we have now as consumers on the planet is actually count the costs of your consumption. It's not actually in the price tag. It's beyond that.
And that's beautifully put. And I saw that on your Substack, which I'm going to give a little link to in our episode show notes for anyone that wants to sign up and follow you. But I think it's, again, it comes back to this monetary issue, which is, to buy a super durable, high quality item is not going to be coming from a fast fashion brand. As you've said, you have to gift these quality items that you've seriously given some thought to people, or people in your, immediate network that maybe, don't have the ability or the access for those kinds of things. So I think that's definitely something to think about, and a great intention that we could perhaps all set and come together with for next year. And I also think, part of the process of researching this episode with all these amazing women on board, including you, has kind of brought a new thought to my mind. And I've seen it a few times on some of the different sustainable fashion websites and brands that I've been looking at in different formats. And this is, about questioning the story behind what we're wearing. And most of us, obviously, I think would agree that we don't want to be wearing a story of death or blood or abuse. And it's one that makes us, feel empowered, that we have on our bodies. And I think it's having a positive impact in the world and coming from a good place that makes us feel that way. And I loved the chat that you had, again, I'm going to refer to with Lily about, greenwashing, which we're going to hear a little bit about shortly, because, transparency, as well as buying less and consuming less, is definitely, one of the ways that we are going to sort the problems out. So, if we were actually going to perhaps elevate a couple of names or fashion brands that might be worth looking at this Christmas, I was thinking, there's 2 that spring to my mind that both begin with P, and one of those is Patagonia. And the other one is Pangaea, I think it is, who says that rather than sustainability, we should sort of talk about rebalancing with nature. And I just kind of wondered, how do you feel about that? What does balancing with nature or rebalancing with nature really look like?
That is so lovely, isn't it? Because that is the way both Pangaea and Patagonia talk about themselves. And actually, we just have to call out Yves Chapard here, because he was the founder of Patagonia, and he was the one who very famously this year signed over the entire value to this huge company now, to Earth, and made Earth, as he famously said in his quote, his only shareholder. And the idea is that all profits now from this company, Patagonia, will be ploughed back into a foundation that will work to protect nature and the environment. And that's all been set up by a third party set of individuals. So it's all completely sort of sound. And it was a real moment, I think, not just for the fashion industry, but the entire business industry and the finance sector, in making people understand what good capitalism looks like. And, and has really kind of set the agenda for the path forward in terms of our responsibility to the world and not just to shareholders. And this is the kind of bigger macro conversation that's going on in all sorts of big circles now, from kind of Davos to Wall Street, which is, actually the path that we're on is not sustainable. At some point, the sort of rapid consumption of all of our natural resources is going to run out, and all these businesses that have built their value on consumption are suddenly going to be worth nothing unless some of that value is returned. And Patagonia has absolutely led the way in that. So much time for him and his company and his family, which backed him in doing this. Pangaea, the other P, is a very different sort of company, very new, only set up 4 or 5 years ago. And it set itself up as a materials innovation company. And basically what they do is innovate around fabrics to create fashion pieces that, in their words, balance with nature. So they create, for instance, biomaterials that are made out of mushroom or hemp as opposed to cotton, because we know that cotton is really water intensive and chemical intensive in its production. Hemp is less so. They sponsor regenerative agriculture projects. And then they pioneer some crazy science. So they brought these sunglasses out where the lenses are made from carbon sequestered from the atmosphere. So they partner with all these brilliant little startups that are doing amazing things. They have peppermint dye in their clothes, which means that you have to wash them less, because the peppermint dye, it's not a clothes dye, but it's a sort of infusion. The peppermint helps keep the clothes fresher for longer. They used black pollution from the air that a brilliant company in India has managed to take air pollution, create black ink and use that as a dye. So they're such a cool company doing so many amazing, clever things. And what they've managed to do is link chemistry and fashion. And previously, the fashion industry was never really able to interface with science, because science has a very long-term view and fashion has a very seasonal view. So if you can't do it for next season, forget it, you're out. Whereas, science says, I can deliver that to you in 7 years' time. But what Pangaia rather has managed to do is to sort of, is to get those two sides of the industry talking to each other, and has had huge success in creating some really exciting products.
I mean, I was amazed when I had a brief conversation with Amanda from Pangaia, who was also in the audience of the conversation that you had with Lily Cole, and became a real part of that chat and answered some of the questions, particularly the one from the 13-year-old. And I think, it was really beautiful that you included her. And obviously she's doing some really inspiring things. And when I think we're all kind of sitting around, probably after listening to this episode, spreading the Christmas cheer of all the things that we can buy for our loved ones in the run-up, I was just like, I have to at least mention, somebody doing something, because there really are some great stories out there. And I don't think we should kind of be in this pit of despair and feeling like we can't have this and we can't have that. I think we just need to focus on the places that we really can elevate and, tap into those stories. And I think, this episode is called From Farm to Hanger. And I think that that's really important to think about, as I said, and as you also pointed out, the regenerative agriculture projects going on, and brands that, really do support those regenerative projects that are going on worldwide, really. I mean, there's some really incredible things happening. As I'm also speaking to some of the other guests later on in the show. Again, if anyone wants to follow you, they can check out the episode show notes. Have a wonderful Christmas.
I love those Jingle bells. Oh, those holiday Jingle bells. Oh, those happy Jingle-bells. I love those Jingle bells.
Next, and could a carbon tax on clothes put a stop to the relentless waste of the fashion industry? And at what point was it even normalised for us to throw our clothes away? Just a few of the questions activist, podcaster, actor, author and model Lily Cole has been asking since COP27 wrapped up in Egypt last month. She sat on many panels to represent the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in Sharm el-Sheikh, and she says she would rather focus her time on trying to reform businesses and supporting those who are trying to do a better job of capitalism in a bid to achieve more systemic change. I caught her in conversation in Ibiza last month at the Alma Festival in the Agora Ibiza boutique. It was right before she headed to COP27, and she started off by assuring us that actually not being perfect when it comes to shopping or even the environment is okay right now, but many of us are just doing our best.
I think that imperfect environmentalism, for me, as a philosophy, I largely think of in terms of individuals, not in terms of companies. I think you could apply the same to companies, but I think mostly in terms of individuals, because in the book I wrote, I look a lot at how individuals can make choices that will help maybe nudge the system in a better way. And yet I think whilst trying to encourage and empower people who are lucky enough to have those choices in their lives, which let's admit many people don't have choice, is important, at the same time, I think we have to bracket that with the fact that we are working in systems that make it pretty much impossible, if not impossible, to not be complicit in these environmental problems and also different social problems. And I say that as someone who's trying, and who's like really imperfect. It's like, it's really hard. And I think if we set this benchmark, which a lot of the communication around climate change has done for the last few decades, of perfection and pointing out what people are doing wrong, yeah, but you're doing this, or yeah, but you can't speak about that because you do this, or etc. We just shut down the conversation and make it really hard, I think, for anybody to try and do a bit better. And actually, interestingly, the concept of the carbon footprint was born in the fossil fuel industry. It was apparently marketing companies for the fossil fuel companies who came up with this concept of a carbon footprint, I think 20 or so years ago, as a way to shift the focus away from accountability to companies and accountability to the energy sector and towards the individual. They actually marketed the concept of like individuals should be caring about their carbon footprint, because then all the emphasis becomes on the individual. And I think it's like many things, it's complicated and it's a paradox. Like, we do have to still take individual responsibility, so I don't think we can use that as an excuse to not care about our own behaviour. But we have to also remember that, like, until companies are made through policies or whatever other means to take their share of the responsibility, it's really hard as individuals to affect the change, the scale that we need. So that's why I kind of try and talk a lot about imperfect environmentalism. I think greenwashing is a different thing, because you can be an imperfect environmentalist and try and do your bit and communicate on the issue and still be honest about the fact that you're imperfect, and actually, in a way, by admitting you're imperfect and calling attention to the things you're not quite doing, whether it's to yourself or to others, you are not greenwashing, you're being honest. I think greenwashing is different. Greenwashing is pretending you're doing more than you actually are. And companies are doing that a lot right now. And as I think we were remarking on last night, that's a problematic symptom of, I would say, a very positive trend, which is that in the last 15 years, actually there is more and more appetite. Like, the greenwashing wasn't such an issue 15 years ago because actually the appetite for environmental action was not so big.
It wasn't a sexy thing.
No. And so in a way I see it as quite a positive sign in a weird way, that actually the trends have shifted so dramatically in the last 15 or so years, especially the last 5 years, that we're seeing so much greenwashing, because suddenly there is this consumer demand for action, there is a political demand for action, and a consequence of that is, without the right tools and frameworks in place to have proper transparency, proper accountability, we have a lot of greenwashing. That needs to be solved, but I'm hoping it's a sort of transitional phase. And I'm going to COP next week with this organisation, the UN Economic Commission of Europe, specifically to talk about this issue. They are working on a kind of initiative called the Sustainability Pledge, which is trying to encourage companies and policymakers to think about how to build proper accountability and transparency in supply chains, so that we can avoid greenwashing, and also so that we can know whether we're meeting our climate goals. Because if we don't have reliable information, which we don't often right now, how can we even say whether we're meeting the goals or not? And so this is an area that policymakers are really looking at, and I would imagine in the next 5 to 10 years we will see a lot of movement towards tools that make it harder to greenwash, and even maybe regulations that make it harder to greenwash.
COP, okay, we all hear about COP. Lots of people go there, there's lots of talking, what actually happens when it comes out. But taking your initiative, is what you're trying to do is build a petition of a swell of people that will then put pressure on governments to build in policy? Or are you trying to build a petition to get companies to just do it anyway? How does it work? How do we change stuff?
Well, I mean, that's a big question and not one that I necessarily know the answer to. I mean, this specific initiative is set up by the UN, of a certain agency called the Economic Commission for Europe. I'm an advisor to kind of ambassador to them for the last year, and as I understand their role, they are trying to encourage both policymakers and also the market, so companies, to be investigating this space. So they build, for example, the UNEC built a blockchain pilot of this idea, blockchain pilot of transparency for supply chains. They're working with a few different fashion brands like Stella McCartney, Vivienne Westwood, to pilot how could we look at a cotton supply chain, for example.
So they build the model to show you can do it.
They build the model to show you can do it, and they've done that for cotton and leather so far. But they're very clear that they don't want to be the model. They're just piloting it to try and generate more kind of energy and conversation around the need for this, and hoping that will galvanize the industry to compete around creating tools, and also policymakers to potentially put more regulations in place that require these tools, so that if a company is saying that they have this carbon footprint, or their cotton or their leather supply chain does X, Y, or Z, they can prove that, and they have a kind of a way of proving that, which right now, and I work with fashion brands, like a consultant for some fashion brands who are trying to be more ethical, and it's quite extraordinary that even the companies that are trying and really want to be more ethical, you ask them, like, where is the very beginning of your supply chain? You know, where does the cotton come from? Like, what are the conditions within which it's made? And they often can't tell you because they can only see 2 layers back. And that visibility makes it really difficult for the company, let alone for the customer, to understand whether the materials are harmful. 1/5 of cotton apparently is coming from the region in China that has forced labor right now in concentration camps. Yeah. You know, these are like serious issues that are like swelling into and moving into supply chains without us even being aware of it.
Standards agencies are also really struggling. So I think GOTS, for instance, which is the certification of organic cotton, there was a big investigation in the New York Times earlier this year which showed that, in fact, more organic cotton coming out of India than had ever been planted. So something was going wrong. And actually this, goes back to my point about greenwashing, which is some people are just trying really hard, but they don't, like, as you say, have the transparency to know when they're actually not managing to achieve what they want to achieve. And then there's also people who don't have a full grasp of, they, for instance, there's a lot of recycled nylon that we have in this store, things like Econel, which again is coming from recovered nylon or plastic or fishing nets from the sea. But the process of turning that back into a fabric is extremely heavy on energy as well. And actually, it's really hard to get the consumer to understand this. I mean, like, guys, we just want to shop and buy something and feel not guilty. And actually, it's so complicated, some of the stories.
Which is, I personally think, why you need more regulation, because, we regulated against slavery. Arguably slavery still happens, but legally it shouldn't. We regulated for a minimum wage. We regulated over certain things in history, and I hope for the day where we can buy products and not be complicit in the deforestation of the Amazon in the process, and not be complicit in slave labour in China, and not be complicit in all the various different things that are still happening within supply chains. And I mean, personally, that's why I think the regulation piece is really important. But I think the voluntary piece of customers demanding that, and companies, because of consumer pressure or because of their own, moral compasses within the company, voluntarily pushing towards that will help accelerate that transition, and is already accelerating, I think, that transition.
I love those J-I-N-G-L-E bells. Oh, those holiday J-I-N-G-L-E bells. Oh, those happy J-I-N-G-L-E-B-E-double-L-S. I love those J-I-N-G-L-E bells.
Hey, I'm Neliana Fuenmayor, and I'm the founder of A Transparent Company.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode about sustainable fashion. Can you just tell us a little bit about, where your journey, I guess, in fashion began?
It began in Venezuela, where I'm from, and I grew up in my mom's boutique surrounded by materials and trimmings, and I wanted to study fashion in a capital of the world, and I moved to London at 19, and I went to University of the Arts London, where I lived for 15 years.
So after you finished uni, presumably you then became a fashion designer?
Yes, I worked for some of the brands in London, luxury brands, and I went also back to school to do my master's in entrepreneurship and innovation, where I focused on transparency in fashion.
What was it during your time as a fashion designer in London? What was it that you witnessed, perhaps, that made you feel like it was more important to pursue the angle of transparency?
What I noticed, it was the disconnection between design and production processes, and I realized that there had to be something done towards making that connected so that the actual product has a story to tell and the brand can also communicate this.
How would you describe disconnection?
Silos. So imagine a chain, and each blockchain has a pearl that it's in itself its own world and it's part of a structure. But if it's not, let's say, linear, it's disrupted by complex systems, and fashion is one of them. It's very, very opaque and it's complex.
So obviously, you've been working in that world for a while in London, but then I guess what made you come to Ibiza?
Ibiza came in my life as a very interesting surprise between finishing my master's and starting my new job at Stella McCartney back in 2015. And I have a lot to thank to Ibiza because it started a journey for me on a personal level. And Ibiza has a lot of creativity, design, and nature, which I absolutely love. And the community here, it's very international and cosmopolitan, and I've straight linked to London. So for me, it had a lot of elements that made sense for me to keep coming back.
Mm. Do you feel like living on an island like this, as you say, surrounded by nature, kind of maybe drives you forward to, really want to make that disconnection clearer?
Yeah, I believe it's part of connecting the dots. And for me, being from Venezuela and not being able to go there for political issues for more than 10 years has been a way to connect with something that is familiar, nature, and my language, Spanish, and still be part of this global community that exists here in Ibiza.
How would you describe, as you say, breaking down these silos? I mean, obviously that's what you witnessed in London, and that's what made you kind of want to do this work. How did you sort of begin that process?
When I was doing my dissertation back in 2014, I found out about the concept of blockchain as technology that could be the new internet, and I am very curious, and I started researching more. And it turns out that this is a technology that can help connect silos because its nature is decentralized. It's not hierarchy, or is not centralized as we are used to, being part of systems. So for me, it was a representation of how can that help supply chains in fashion to work more openly, collaboratively, and with more trust.
For some reason, whenever anyone mentions the word blockchain, a bit like Bitcoin, I don't know, I just tap out in my head. I just cannot quite compute what this actually means. So I think, obviously we've been hearing Lily talk about, this idea of piloting some projects with blockchain in the fashion world. But, you seem to be the right lady to maybe ask this question, like, what is blockchain?
Yes, that's what I did for many, many years. And it always resonates to different audiences. But blockchain essentially is a database that it's not kept in your own, let's say, computer. It's actually shared amongst different computers in a decentralized network that every actor that is part of this network will verify that the information you're inputting is correct or not. So there is a consensus, there is a process in which everybody needs to agree that this data is correct. And this data, when it's inputted, cannot be changed or tampered. So allows for this information to preserve integrity, data quality, and it's reputation, basically. You don't want to be the red flag in the whole system and the network. I know it sounds a bit confusing, but imagine a bowl of apples and you put a bad apple and then you know what's going to happen. But the idea is to get the apple out as soon as possible so that the whole system can sustain and thrive itself.
No, you've explained that really well, and I can actually get my head around it finally. Okay, so for example, then I was making a range of linen women's wear for summer in Ibiza next year, and I decided to input some data about, an amazing farm I'd found like in the middle of nowhere in India, for example. Surely all of the farms and all of the individual suppliers and all of the manufacturers aren't already registered. Some of them must be quite far-flung and maybe not already in there yet.
Yes, so that's actually the beauty. There are systems now today that you can tap into and softwares that are let's say, pay as you go, where you can invite your supply chain to be part of it. So imagine that farmer or supplier in India that you're working with, they will have to say who they are. It's almost like in having a network that you invite people in to be part of your system, your network. So it's not you saying they are great. You're saying, I have a brand and these are my suppliers, and everybody takes responsibility for what they are claiming. So that's also part of the beauty, that is not only on the brand's shoulders, it's actually on every actor. Every step of the supply chain will be verified by its own, let's say, owner. And that's where the reputation risk is very interesting, because nobody wants to look bad. So whatever they're claiming, they need to have verifiable information.
Fascinating. And this has never fascinated me before. So this is good. I'm interested. So when, Lily obviously spoke to us about this idea that the UN were working with blockchain to pilot ways to find the supply chain and to verify it, as you say, what did that look like in the initial phases when obviously that sustainability pledge was being put together?
Yeah, so I started working with the UNCE back in 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, actually, when this series of pilots kicked off and a project to create the correct criteria and standards for the industry, textile, garment, and footwear, to bring this information out there and educate the industry on what blockchain can bring and how to enhance traceability and transparency. So I've been part of this group of experts, and it's been fascinating to work with many stakeholders that everybody has different challenges. So in a small supply chain, as we have done with pilots back in 2017, we tracked the world's first garment on blockchain. That's easier to communicate and educate. But when we have bigger supply chains, there has to be systems and frameworks and due diligence and legal data sharing documents and what have you that will be required in order for this to scale.
It's quite intriguing to think about, that process, because I think, how big can one supply chain be? I mean, it's obviously, I don't know how clothes are made. I've never witnessed that firsthand. But I think it's kind of fascinating to imagine all the labels I see in a lot of clothes are made in China or made in India, made in Thailand as well. I mean, I see a lot of that specifically on Ibiza. But I guess when you really think about it, I mean, what does that even mean? Because to say something is made somewhere, obviously I know that it's imported and it's travelled a long way to get to me, but I have really just that doesn't really explain, as you said, like what happened along the way or what process that went through or how many pairs of hands or how many chains in the supply chain. So I think this feels really important to have some technology that can help us, and obviously probably been a long time coming really, because people talk about the supply chain and, sustainable fashion, but you can't have one without the other, really. And everyone, I think, feels that there's nothing sustainable about fashion. And obviously, when we were talking at the beginning of the episode about, if everyone wore a pre-loved outfit for Christmas, then we would be a hell of a lot better off. And everyone's buying stuff without really having any kind of conscience, I think, about where these things have come from. And it feels like a moment in time that we actually really need to take responsibility for the things that we're buying and actually care about where they come from. I think, that's what I'm experiencing after reading all of this information over the past few weeks. What did those initial pilots look like? How did you even begin to think, well, how do I create pilots for Stella McCartney or Vivienne Westwood?
Yeah, so it came about that it started in March 2020, so we had to do it online. And there were many, many meetings and calls on Zoom. And we were at 4 different groups, and I was part of the pilot group. And because I have experience on implementing the technology in supply chains, I was able to give my input on how the process was going to be built up from scratch, and even the tender to choose the solution provider that was going to do the actual software. And yeah, there was a lot of hours of looking at even data fields and data points and identifying what the questions will need to be so that a supplier can answer them. So a lot of very technical, tedious work. But it was very interesting to see it coming into a reality, and not only that, but actually having real-world stakeholders wanting to understand how this is going to work. And also, this is not a technology that has all the answers. So it's a lot of challenges to tap into it and make it accessible. So it was very beneficial to hear from suppliers like Mills, okay, yes, we could do this, but actually in real life, in practice, this wouldn't work like this. So it was very informative. This solution is a stepping stone into what could be an industry-wide and sector-agnostic solution because it's open source.
I mean, as if 2020 wasn't as tedious enough. You were doing one of the most tedious tasks of us all. So hats off to you for that, for starters. So I think it's quite interesting, obviously there's not many people that haven't heard of Vivienne Westwood. So I was very happy to see that she was part of one of the first pilot schemes. Did the UN approach Vivienne Westwood to be part of things?
Yes, the UN approached Vivienne Westwood because one of their offices is in Milan, and the project manager of the UNECE, she contacted them, and the whole point was to create the first pilot on Egyptian cotton. Why Egyptian cotton? Because, for example, we are used to hearing Egyptian cotton is one of the best ones, but actually it's being misused. And the Egyptian government wanted to make sure that there was a way for them to preserve the origin and the quality and retake back the reputation of Egyptian cotton. So, again, this is part of why we need technologies that help verify that something's actually true. So, yeah, it all started with that, and then the brand decided to be part of the pilot and create garments that went into sale.
That's so funny, though. It's so true, isn't it? Everyone, like even hotels or Airbnb, Egyptian cotton sheets and pillows, and immediately like, I bet that sounds nice. Is that quite outrageous, actually, when you even look at the linguistics of that, the way that people do take ownership of probably, God only knows how much hard work goes into actually even making the stuff.
Yeah, and you have to think that sometimes a cotton t-shirt has cottons from 5 different countries in one garment. So it's very important for those that care about where and how they make their products that it's kept and there's no counterfeiting and there's no false claims.
So obviously I know that you weren't there for the full duration of the project to give us a report on how things panned out with Vivienne. But I would love to, what do you feel like maybe perhaps once this pilot is complete, that perhaps that is going to, lay down the gauntlet really for other brands to perhaps do the same?
Yeah, actually, we did manage to meet in person in September 2021 in Milan, and the pilot was presented, and for us to understand all the steps that it took for it to actually become a garment and be on retail. It was an internal pilot, so there was not a lot of communication, but the Egyptian cotton made it to jeans and tops.
That's incredible. I think this is great because obviously, as you say, Vivienne is one of those pillars of the community. And I'm guessing, once she said yes and she's kind of managed to get through the process, that must be encouraging for other people who want to take part. I think it's very interesting what you just pointed out there, because Lily mentioned that leather and cotton specifically, and one of the, approved statuses that I'm seeing a lot on sustainable fashion brands' websites is this GOTS. And I think that was also spoken about in the conversation, the longer version of the conversation with Lily that Tiffany had, and it, about where cotton comes from and how do you approve it, because I think there's some very salubrious places that produce cotton in a very unpleasant fashion. You know, people are doing horrible things to make cotton. And again, we didn't know about any of these stories until these kind of bodies came around, I think, to start putting their stamp on things to let us know that this cotton is coming from an ethical source. So I guess in the long term, this could start to, you know, cause a fashion revolution, essentially. I think that's the name of the next guest that we're going to be speaking to. But I feel, you know, this is a really good step in the right direction.
Yes, it's important to understand what certifications mean as well. And again, it's complex, but we choose who to trust and get into business with. And so in a way, what you just said about a supermarket, when we don't have time, we go to the sources that we trust for some reason, and brand trust is really important. So the same with certifications, and there's so many certifications out there. It's really hard to discern if you don't really know, but GOTS is one of the greatest certifications, and they're doing a great job. And the technology like blockchain can help bring all the certifications in one single source of truth, which is how I call it, to create a sense of an information layer that allows us to all collaborate and be part of a system that allows us to have trust in a trustless network, where there's a lot of silos, but actually we can connect the dots. And at the end, this is how we can create product passports so that we understand what has been the journey of that product. And it's very important, where is it going post-consumer?
It's just, you know, in this globalized world that we live, localizing things for me feels like the answer to everything, really. Not just for clothes, but for food and for, you know, labor and for a million different things. And we've had, you know, Helena Norberg-Hodge of Local Futures talking about localization a lot on this podcast. And I think ultimately it always comes back to the same thing. And that's really, you know, an interesting point, I think, to end this little chapter of this wonderful smorgasbord of amazing women talking to me. And I'm so impressed by what you do and the fact that you are, you know, doing this tedious and technical tasks on the behalf of the consumer, because I think there's such a need for this. And so I want to say a massive thank you for that. And also, congratulations on your TED Talk, which is coming up also in March next year. So if people are interested by what we've been talking about today, I think we've just sort of touched the surface of some of the themes that are in your talk. But essentially, if people want, you know, are more interested in, I think, some of the more heartfelt feelings behind why you do the work that you do and what you'd really like to see as well, then they can catch all of that at Can Ventosa on the 29th of March. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jo, for this opportunity, and I'm super happy to share my experience as a fashion designer, becoming a solution designer that is trying to bring transparency into this industry, which is fashion.
I love those Jingle bells. Oh, those holiday Jingle bells. Oh, those happy Jingle-bells. I love those Jingle bells.
So I'm joined by Nadege Seguin, coordinator of the Fashion Revolution in Spain, which was set up in the wake of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013. Since then, the group have grown to become the world's largest fashion activist movement, mobilising citizens, brands and policymakers through research, education and advocacy. Nadege, thank you so much for joining us as part of this episode on sustainable fashion.
Nice to be here, thank you.
Can you just tell us a little bit, first off, about what actually happened in Bangladesh and how the movement came to be? Because next year, it will be the 10th anniversary of the deaths of more than 1,100 textile workers. Can you just, for people that don't know what happened there, perhaps you could tell us why, you formed Fashion Revolution?
Yeah, everything started because a building in Bangladesh called Rana Plaza found out a lot of workers who were working here for a lot of fast fashion brands died in this day, and it was not the first time, but it was the first time it's gone so mediatic. So we could, as consumer, see as directly what happened in those countries where we're sending our clothing to be made, And it was the first time for us to understand the impact of our choices when we're buying fashion and how we should change to things to get it better, to make it more ethical.
So what work is being done then to end human environmental exploitation in the global fashion industry currently?
Well, we're working on a lot of ranges or different things. We're working in the two main points of sustainability that are social and ecological. And right now, for example, we're working with a campaign called Good Clothes for Pay, where we are collecting signatures for the European Union, to make them apply a law who protects the workers from the fashion industry in terms of fair wages.
Where are you at with that right now? What's the next step?
Yes, it just started, so now we'll keep on collecting it. We'll be working until next year in September, and everyone who wants to participate can go on the webpage goodclothesforpay.eu and just appoint their name and to make the governments know that they want a change. And we're still working in campaigning about all the different points that we need to change into the industry, from use of chemicals, the exploitation of the workers, impact into global warming, and a lot of different ways that fashion is getting dark and not so glamorous. And we're working also to organize the next Fashion Revolution Weeks. That would be the next 24th of April, where we are doing events in all the country to make people know what happened and make them participate into this change for the new fashion industry.
We will put that link actually in the episode show notes if anyone wants to go and sign up for that. So what needs to happen next to create safer and more dignified working conditions globally?
What we need are laws, because if there is no controls about what people say in terms of being greener, so big enterprise are particularly only doing greenwashing right now. They're just saying that they are doing things well when they are not. And this is also having an impact on all the people who are actually trying to do it better, but don't have the same mediatic impact at those big enterprises. And so what we need is to be sure that when someone is pretending to doing something better, that they are actually doing it right.
I mean, that's definitely something that we touched on in the last conversation with Neliana about transparency, and it keeps coming back to this same thing. How would you describe then for people locally, the conditions of maybe, say, Spanish brands specifically? Are there any shops that we should be avoiding this Christmas?
You should avoid all the big brands, big companies, big international companies. Try to go back to local production, small artisan production, and people who are working with sustainability, and who can prove that they're working with sustainability.
So what are your thoughts then on this kind of throwaway culture that we live in the run up to Christmas? And obviously, this is coming out, today's the 23rd of December that this is being published, and, people are in that sort of panic buy mode.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. And it's getting worse every year. And we need to change the culture we have around Christmas. We need to know to choose better gift if you want to have a little detail with the people we love. We need to choose better the people who we want to buy things for. And we need to also think differently from only buy material things. We can also share experiences or other way to show the appreciation we have for the people we love.
How can we shift then to a system where materials are used for much longer and absolutely nothing goes to waste?
That's cradle to cradle. We need to reinvent all the chain. I mean, we must start thinking about circularity, but not only in terms of reuse and repair, but also in base of how the material we use will be absorbed by the earth. So we need to start producing clothing that are biodegradable, for example, and we won't contaminate the earth when we just throw it away. And we must start to think about production of things that will last for their design and for their durability and quality.
So, I guess that brings us on then to encouraging heritage fashion and also craftsmanship. I think, in a world where local wisdom is recognised and valued. So what do you think about, the island or, Ibiza's specific offering in terms of sustainable fashion?
Well, Ibiza there's not too many brands working with sustainable fashion right now, but we have the particularity because Ibiza is a small place where we are accustomed to have small markets where people can resell their clothing that they didn't use. We must be careful to not lose this at the cost to fill our markets with Indian stuff and cheap stuff. But if we can maintain the idea of just sharing what we have and creating handmade things and share it with the people we have around, so that's a good point. And then we have different initiatives, like the one we have with Fashion Revolution in Ibiza. Ibiza swaps that we're doing every month. We can share the next dates in our Instagram account, Ibiza Swap. And we're inviting people to just take something that they have at home, nice clothes that they have and they're not using, and just come and change it for another one here to make it last.
I love that idea, and often have a little swap shop party with my friends because I just think we're in a phase where obviously you just can't throw clothes away, and it's heartbreaking to be rummaging around and finding things that have still even got labels on that you just have never actually worn. I mean, I had that when I first moved here from living in London, and I was disgusted myself, and I realised how much I pulled out of a suitcase that still had the label on, and I didn't even had no intention of even wearing it.
And that's a process. The first step is to see that we're acting this way and then just try to start working on it. You can make a capsule wardrobe. You can check for which are the sustainable designers that you have around. You can see where you can exchange your clothing with swaps or whatever. You can find new ways to consume and to understand how you use fashion as a person. So it's just a process.
A different mindset is, needs to be cultivated, I think. I'm definitely working on that. I think also, I really love the wording on your own fashion label website where you describe the fact that, we're living in a riotous life, deeply disconnected from the natural environment. And that, I think, is the consequence that we continuously exploit and contaminate the ecosystems on which we depend. And I feel like anyone who lives here and designs can't help but be more connected to nature as a result. So, is that why you gave birth to Eticology with your husband?
Yeah, we needed to know what we can do. A lot of people tend to say that we cannot produce fashion in a sustainable way, like it's impossible. And we wanted to show that this is wrong and it is possible. And here it is. In case it couldn't be reused, it will probably end it in a landfill where it won't contaminate like other clothes do.
I mean, you say that, the clothes are created from organic, minimalist fashion with natural eco-print vegetable dyes. And I saw, The Perfect Dressed, for example, which was actually called The Perfect Dress, and it totally was. And I'm kind of in love with it, and it's on my Christmas list. Has, the OCC guarantee and got certified cotton. Where do most of those fabrics come from? I have no idea about any of this stuff. So I'm very interested when you say something has got a certain certification. Like, where does it, if it's been certified, but where do you get that from?
Well, I got it from an enterprise called Organic Cotton Colors. We have a lot of certification by themselves because they have a project where they reuse old seeds because cottons have... Cotton suffers a lot of changes through time, so the original seeds who were not changed with OGM, they work with land races cotton who's not genetically modified and would say don't use So they're working with regenerative agriculture and they are making seeds of cotton and different colors of cotton came back into the world when they were practically disappear, where they have a control on all the chain from the moment they choose the seeds to the last moment where they are creating the fabric. and they have transparency enough to tell me that if I want to know something, they can give me the phone number of the people who produce it, and I can go there and just say it myself. So that's what I'm looking in a provider. And then from our part, with this in mind, that we have the purest fabric quality that we can achieve and that we can reach here in Spain from a Spanish company, we work with natural dyes, with plant dyes, where we're not using no chemicals to create prints and colors.
Which is incredible. And actually, it's very interesting to hear that, your brand's producers use, seeds that are going back to their roots and that they are, not genetically modified. It just comes back to all the themes of the podcast because, we've spoken to a lot of farmers about this exact, act of seed sovereignty and taking back, the power from these huge, massive corporate capitalistic monsters who, it's disgusting. And it's great to hear that you not only are knowing exactly where your stuff comes from and the fact that it's local and it's 0 kilometre to a certain degree, that, you also are giving the power back to the farmer, which I think is also extremely important. There's just so many similarities in this kind of story, I think, also about the farm to table movement is the same as like farm to hanger. I saw on the website of one of the sustainable fashion brands that I was investigating in the process of trying to research this episode and understand, not just more about where things come from, but also, what it really looks like, I think, to be sustainable. Obviously, there's so many different ways that you can do that and know and rely on the fact that things are sustainable. I think everyone tends to think that fashion, just by its very nature, as you said, is just not sustainable. But I love the fact that you are actually walking your walk. Is there any other brand on the island that is doing the same thing? Like, is there any other brand that you can maybe give anyone a little bit of a tip off about where they can look for sustainable fashion on Ibiza?
Yeah, there's another brand that I like here in Ibiza. It's called La Brisa Ibiza and La Brisa Ibiza. And she work in, well, we do different things, but I like the way she working also. She also work with organic cottons, and well, if you want to know more about her, you can check their Instagram account. But that's one of the few brands we have here in Ibiza because we're still starting. It's still a movement that we're creating right now in these years.
I'm really grateful that you would point that out, actually, because I'm really, still in this process of trying to find as many people as I can to include in our episode show notes to showcase, what's happening here and that there are other options available. I'm going to also list some of those at the very end of this podcast. If you do want to hear it, keep listening till the end and also have a look in the episode show notes. What about global brands that are sustainable if people can't quite find what it is that they're looking for?
Yeah, there's, for example, a brand who work with wool. It's called Delana, with the letter D, Lana. And they are working on also making this material to come back into her lives, because lately it has been considered something to throw away and not a new reusable material. And they're doing a really good job on working on this and also create nice things with this material. And another one who can be...
While we're waiting for you to come up with another one, because I know I put you on the spot there, I'd like to big up Annie's in Ibiza town in Dalt Villa, because, even though her items are slightly out of my price range, they're all vintage. And I think that's a great thing to have an amazing, amazing boutique full of used clothes that, are unbelievably gorgeous. Like every time I look at her Instagram account, I'm blown away, and clearly my body will never fit into those items and they're out of my price range, but I just think it's great. It's like that's exactly what we should have for the kinds of people who tend to flock to this island in summertime. They're fashionistas, they want to be looking good, and there are options available that, I'm always so disappointed when I go into Ibiza town. I see Mango and Zara and all of these quite cheap and cheerful kind of like global brands that for me, I'm not going there. That's the only reason I ask you this question, because I think, we need to have more awareness of like what else exists. And I tend not to do my shopping on Ibiza for clothes at all.
Yeah, I think we choose start by looking to stop going into those big brands and look for local products, small productions, reusable fashion, and every different alternative that we can have to fast fashion is a good first step. Then if we want especially certified sustainable fashion, we need to check to transparency and to know which materials are being used in the process. But if we start with just getting away from those big places, it's a good step to start first.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. I cannot quite believe, we've managed to round up all this amazing information just in time for Christmas, and your contribution is incredible. And if anyone wants to check out Eticology, please do head to the episode show notes, and that one is going to be in a little roundup of all the best places to have a look at in the run up to Christmas. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
A quick roundup of the best of the island's sustainable fashion brands and shopping spots as promised. Number one is Eticology, as you've just been hearing, founded by Nadej and her husband. Head to eticology.com for more information. In at number two, we have A Piece of Ibiza, a collection of timeless femininity made sustainable in Ibiza from natural fabrics woven in Europe. In at number three, I want to reflag Annie's in Ibiza town. Annie Doble is passionate about working with smaller upcoming brands and tries to ensure the brands she houses have a low carbon footprint, with many of the brands she stocks being handmade or vintage, or as she describes, in the archive. Then we have Plastic Lab and their recycled jewellery collection, made in their laboratory of circular design, which promotes a participative approach to tackling plastic waste. And finally, our fifth brand is Of Origin, which aims to reduce waste where possible, including the need to import materials from elsewhere. Check them out in our top 5 in our episode show notes. That is it from me. I will see you in 2023. Thank you so much for listening to this series this year. If you want to support this series, then do head to our Just Giving page. It's brand new and it's listed there in our episode show notes. See you back here next year. Happy New Year.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Joe Yule. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves.
Calling upon my witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere, my brothers everywhere. The time has come together.